Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the portrayal of Asian women in the United States, the history of that portrayal, and how that portrayal has had long-lasting effects, both culturally and legally, for Asians, Asian women in particular, and for society as a whole. My guest for this conversation is Celine Parreñas Shimizu, professor and director of the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. Her work focuses on race and sexuality in global popular culture. In 2007, she published the book, The Hypersexuality of Race, and last year she released the book, The Proximity of Other Skins. She joins us via Zoom. Celine Parreñas Shimizu, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you, Mitch.
What does it mean? And I think most people probably have a sense of this, but as somebody who works on this issue specifically, what does it mean when we talk about the sexualization of any race? And of course, we'll obviously talk about specifically for Asians.
Specifically for Asian American women, the sexualization of race can be captured in how they were historically constructed in the law, as well as in their very experiences of entry into the United States. In recent days, because of the violence in Atlanta, for the first time, many people are hearing about the 1875 Page Act, which really barred the entry of Chinese women to the United States as organized around the particular idea of the possibility of there being prostitutes. And what that really meant was they were going to bring in a different kind of morality, a different kind of sexual option, the threat of different sexual culture. And this created a lot of anxiety because there was a large influx of Asian Americans. And, Asian Americans primarily, the earliest immigrants were bachelor societies. And the whole goal was to bring in cheap labor rather than the opportunity to establish families, to change, the racial demographic of the United States. And so the barring of Asian women was related to both the fears of changing demographic, of what the racial national identity of Americans would be. But then also, this was really tied to a sexualization that meant, were they going to offer a kind of new delight and that would threaten, what the American family would look like. And at the same time, this sexualization is really experienced as a kind of force within representation. So mass culture in the late 19th century really witnessed, these kind of operatic constructions, very dramatic renderings of Asian women as excessively sexualized beings. Just really once again offering a kind of overwhelming threat to Western men about a different kind of sexuality. So it's an overwhelming sexuality, one that didn't seem to recognize what was an appropriate dosage of love, desire, sex, because, in plays like Madame Butterfly in 1904 and Madame Chrysanthemum, Asian women, were devoted to the white male lover in a way that wasn't really reciprocated, and it went overboard. It didn't recognize that maybe the guy wasn't all that into her, but she invested, so much that she ended up, killing herself to prove her love, giving up her child to prove her love. I mean, that's going over the cliff. But what is our attachment to that construction of the overwhelmingly, excessively devoted, strange, almost perverted kind of sexual person, because it gets repeated over time in various representations, all the way to Miss Saigon in our present, one of the most lucrative, productions that witnessed this very same woman. So in a sense, the way I would define the sexualization of race is that, Asian American women are a kind of placeholder of ideologies of sexuality and racialization that really had a lot of meaning in terms of who was going to become, a viable, wife, a viable, female citizen, in this country. And we cannot understand the sexualization of Asian American women without really thinking about how they were constructed against the white woman as, a more innocent sexual being who needed to be protected. Because, in a play, in an opera play like Madame Butterfly and Miss Saigon, her perverse and excessive sexuality was really countered to the white woman's normal sexuality. So there's a comparative dimension that we cannot ignore.
That's interesting to the white woman, as you talk about. And we see this beginning in early 20th century on the theater. Was it Madame Butterfly that really begins this, or is it more complicated than that, or both?
It's hard to say, when this construction of a different, othered, more perverse kind of sexuality that's been attributed to Asian women began. But, the colonial encounter between Asia and the West really produced, this circulation of images, and there's no shortage of them. It didn't just happen in theater. It also extended to film, right? So Anna May Wong was the first Asian American, really major Hollywood figure. And one of her first films was a 1920 film called Toll of the Sea, the first Technicolor film, amazing achievement in terms of an aesthetic, development in cinema. And at the same time, it was really a repetition of the Asian woman as this repository of a strange kind of sexuality, that was very intriguing and entertaining for the white male lover, but then became so excessive and so scary that he ended up, going back to the US and essentially forgetting about her while she remained so entirely devoted to him. He comes back, to China with his white wife, and she then finally sees that he has forgotten about her. He does not regard her in the same way that she has completely elevated him, in her life, in her life's meaning. And she ends up, drowning herself, killing herself, giving up her child and giving it to the white American couple, who takes off with this child. So it's hard to say, when it started. I think that there's so much more work to be done in terms of digging up, this relationship that's been represented on screen. I think it's so gendered in the sense that the woman is really rendered in sexual service of white men. And it's a kind of sexual service that is a sacrifice of her own self. So it's a sexual being for others in a way that exposes how, the white male lover doesn't really regard her pleasure, her experience, but really sees her as an object for himself. And it keeps going. I mean, this repetition keeps going, so that what I assert in my book is that to be an Asian American woman is to have to contend with this huge inheritance of images that define your sexuality, not in your own terms, but, really in terms of serving men.
It's there, and you and other Asian women are facing this on a daily basis.
Definitely. I began my book, with this scene when I was 17 years old, riding the 51 bus. And
now that's here in the Bay Area. You're going to UC Berkeley. We all know the 51.
Yeah, the 51 bus goes from Alameda to Oakland to the Berkeley campus. And so I was a 17-year-old, Berkeley first-year student. And an older man came up to me while I was in the back of the bus and asked me if he had seen me before. Wasn't I a prostitute, in Angeles or Olongapo in the Philippines next to the American military bases? And he actually said this out loud in front of people. Didn't I throw ping pong balls out of my vagina? And I remember, just being so shocked. But what really struck me in my mind at that time, Mitch, was I am not that woman. Yeah. There was this conflation that I resisted that frightened me because I immediately wanted to go to the side of good womanhood, the kind of womanhood that has been attributed to white women, and instead refused the notion that I could be that person. So there was this conflation of, a Filipino woman from the Philippines, a Filipino woman in the United States. We were the same, but clearly we weren't the same. In my mind, I was thinking I'm, a 17-year-old upwardly mobile young woman in a Research One public university. I am not that woman. And that was scary to me because these women are closer to me than white women in a sense, because we're being conflated. Our identities are colliding. And it was really important to me not to disavow sex workers, not to disavow women who are considered bad in our society because of the structures that forced them to be in low wage work, not having particular choices that I had. So the book really became about really exploring what it meant to be living under definition of sexuality for Asian American women that should not lead to disavowing not only how sexuality is a force of discipline, but also can be a source of pleasure. And Asian American women should not be deprived of our own, sexual awakening, our own pleasure. Sexuality is a source of life. And so the book really interrogated, the earliest representations of this sexual imposition of character and identity and practice, this assertion that Asian American women or Asian women can offer, heterosexual men or men, different kinds of sexual experiences that you don't get from other women. And I wanted to trace that, to work as an historian of representations. And so I went from theater to the earliest films, this construction of the hyper heterosexual Asian American femme fatale in Hollywood. And then I couldn't but go, to the side of pornography, because pornography promises to go where Hollywood doesn't go. And I wanted to see, well, what are the sex acts that are being attributed to Asian American women, and how is the language of film being used to provide kind of visible evidence of that? To see is to know, and how film provides that, kind of visual facticity of this, fantasy, this claim that Asian American women provide excessive sexuality, perverse sexuality, proclivity for sexuality, perpetual availability. What is that looking like in pornography? And then also closing with how Asian American women themselves are refusing to live under this polar binary of good womanhood and bad womanhood, and instead are using the medium of film to explore the vast expanse of the middle, and really defining their own sexual desires, their own sexual practices, their own sexual identities.
The history of the betrayal of Asian women, do you also, is this, do you think, and I think today everything's so globalized and intermingled, I'm positive we find it everywhere today, but the history, if you look at the early 20th century, is this an American thing, or do you also see it happening in European countries, especially European colonial powers that were involved with colonial projects throughout Asia?
The representation of Asian women as hypersexual beings, the repository of excessive sexuality, the idea that they are not only contaminating in terms of creating desire, fascinating, mesmerizing, different, but then also this strange idea, historical idea, that Asians are also contagious in terms of disease really come together in terms of the sexual, intrigue towards Asian women that not only come from the United States, but are also present in, cultural productions, in Europe, right? So Madame Butterfly, comes from Europe, Puccini. Um, the Good Woman of Sichuan, Madame Chrysanthemum. They are, European productions that circulated, transnationally and found themselves on the stages of the U.S. So it's definitely a transnational formulation. However, Mitch, your question, makes me really think of, you know, wars with Asia and the West, so the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and how they produced not only particular kinds of laws, but the representation of Asian women as prostitutes, so this was really organized in terms of military presence in Asia, the construction of rest and recreation or rest and relaxation for the military. This was, by no means accidental, but it was cultivated by this relationship between two nations, right? And, the women who worked as sex workers, had to get, testing. And this was not organized just by the women themselves. It was really organized, structurally, between the military and the resident nation, and so it's interesting to think about, the rampant images of the Asian woman as a prostitute. So if you're an Asian American actor and you look at your resume or the opportunities for casting you, much like, how many times do Asian American male actors have to write unspeaking, Chinese delivery waiter, on their resume, the availability of roles as prostitutes slash sex workers are available for Asian American women. And it's interesting to think about representations like The World of Susie Wong, a box office hit in 1960, just a gorgeous film, the sex worker, Nancy Kwan, portrayed this role with her dancer's body and her dancer's movement and a very elegant countenance. And it was a huge hit. However, people attribute that film as the birth of this representation of the Asian woman prostitute and extended that to, the movement from the availability of prostitutions through the military experience towards a more commercial sex industry. And really this equation of Hollywood films that led to the sex tourism industry, where Asian American feminists have called it, the treatment of Southeast Asian countries, et cetera, as a kind of brothel for the West. And so that's what I think of when you ask me about the transnational circulation of these images, but then there's also this transnational, traffic in bodies, that are happening where Western men, from Europe and the US, go to Asia and participate in the sex industry, and come back. And sometimes, there's also this movement of brides, war brides or sex workers who marry, their Johns.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Celine Parreñas Shimizu. She's a professor and director of the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. Her work does focus on race and sexuality and popular culture. She is the author of such books as The Hypersexuality of Race, and last year she released her book, The Proximity of Other Skins. Do you find a shift in the portrayal in popular culture, in cinema, in movies, in theater, maybe books, of Asian women that corresponds with the Korean and Vietnam Wars?
Well, what's interesting is that in the time of the Korean War, there was a rise in the representation of war brides in pornography. And what's so interesting about it is that prior to the Korean War, really, and prior to World War II, the representation of Asian women in pornography was composed of white women in yellowface. So they were performing Asian womanhood, and they did it through, accoutrements, strangely, of course, nonsensically, chopsticks in the hair, fans, shoji screens, different kinds of orientalia that made visible what was inherently not visible, which is, sexual racialization. It had to be asserted through these decorations, and it also had to be asserted through intertidal text. Because what was famous about the earliest pornography, which is called, stag pornography, it's unlike contemporary pornography, which really focuses on, the money shot and male ejaculate. At the time, it was satisfying in itself to see filmic representations of genitalia. But what happened there, because they were not Asian women biologically, they were white women pretending to be Asian women, they would interrupt the genital shot with intertidal text that would say, look, it's the slanted vagina. They didn't necessarily say that. I'm trying to remember the exact words that they used in the intertidal text. It's in the book. And so they would describe what was, genital difference that you couldn't see in order to eroticize the experience and say, this is something, really different. But after, World War II and the Korean War, there was this upsurge of Asian women you would see in pornography, for the first time. And unlike, seeing, orientalia instruments inserted into the genital shot, instead, what you would see is, an Asian woman normalized into domesticity to make an argument about their presence suddenly as, war brides. Women that US military men, were bringing home. And so it's interesting what pornography shows us, about fantasy in relation to history. Because what was interesting in the earlier stag films is that, what was going on at the time was this fear of Asian immigration. Asians were barred from coming into this country. I mean, it's interesting that, Filipinos like me, were able to come back and forth, until the Tidings-McDuffie Act, where, their classification changed and they could no longer travel, back and forth. So there was this, fear about Asians coming in as a kind of threat to national demographics and the American family, and making sure that Filipino men, Chinese men, Japanese men weren't marrying, white women and creating these mixed race families. So Asian women, couldn't come in. So, it's interesting that they were really considered a threat, but in the pornography, in stag pornography, they were really considered a kind of racial sexual treat. So it's interesting. Historically, they were a threat. In pornography, they were a treat. But then when Asian women started showing up in pornography, there was an argument being made that they were legible, intelligible as wives. So instead of the insertion of orientalia into the genital shot, suddenly there's like a diamond ring in a hand in the genital shot, to show that they're married and they're having, sex within marital relations. And it was a normalization of miscegenation, which was, considered illegal at the time, in many states. And so that's really interesting, how, pornography really shows a kind of making sense of changing relationships, changing, demographics, and a changing status of Asian women. Because, prior to the lifting of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was the implementation of the 1945 War Brides Act, which then, exceeded the quotas of who can come in and made an exception for Asian women who were the brides of military, US men. So this included not only Chinese, Japanese, Korean, but also, Filipino women and, South Asian women.
My understanding is that in researching sexuality and race, you spent a good amount of time at the Kinsian Institute,
Yes.
especially a place where you were researching how porn uses race, and it's interesting. One, isn't there a shift right around in the '90s specifically of what happens to Asian women in this portrayal, and then maybe if I'll just put this up front. Two, it seems as though porn, which is ubiquitous, everyone can access it now, which is kind of interesting to think about. So hence, promoting more, stereotypes about people. But the other part is porn uses racial terms in a way that it would otherwise never be acceptable in society.
So, Mitch, you're right. I spent a lot of time at the Kinsey Institute watching about 200 plus films that really started from stag films in the 1920s, which were these illegally made, short films, donated anonymously to the Kinsey Institute, sometimes they would be dropped off at the steps, and the librarians would come and just find boxes of these materials. The police would also help and say, we found these materials, and it became a place to study them. And what was amazing about Alfred Kinsey was that he really came up with a method of reading sex acts in films without judgment and with detailed description. And it included taking account of people who appeared on screen, from a different race. And unlike, Black and white, African American, pornography, you can't quite tell skin color difference. In African American stag pornography, there was such an emphasis on skin color difference, that here is visible evidence, proof that interracial sex is happening. But with Asian and Asian American representations, because they definitely had films that came from Asia as well, you couldn't quite tell the skin color difference when it was interracial sex. And so in interracial sex, they established that racial difference through props and through intertidal text to narrate a sexual difference that you visibly, couldn't see. And then from there, I looked at, films from the 50s and the 60s that really directly related to the wars. And then after that, there was a rise in the golden age of pornography, where the films were becoming just so much more cinematic and dramatic and with high production values. And there was a rise of Asian American porn stars. And, throughout the work that I did, in looking at stag films, which really established the presence of white women in yellowface, and I was really asking questions about what is the sexual fantasy life of the nation during a time of yellow peril, and trying to really identify what was the particular role of Asian women, in national fantasies that really racialized their sexual attributes. And then what happened, later on, towards the, so yeah, in the 40s and the 50s, it was really this establishment of, women who you met and experienced through the war and somehow domesticated into wives. But then after that, in the 70s on, there was the rise of the Asian American porn star, Linda Wong, Mai Lin, Christara Barrington, and then the people we recognize more recently, Asia Carrera, who entered the mainstream and, did cameos in Hollywood films, and then the controversial figure Annabelle Chong from the 90s. She was a, women's studies, feminist studies major at USC, and she was really the first to do this genre of pornography called the world's biggest gangbang. And she had sex with almost 300 men. Um, and it really extended this notion that, Asian American women can represent, the most perverse kind of sexuality.
Did she have politics at all as part of this? Did she see it as a political thing? I mean, as you're saying, she was somebody who was well versed in feminism.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that Annabelle Chong was very explicit about saying, I am conscious throughout this process. I am not in any way drugged, or unawake. I am very alert to the project of what I'm doing, which is to really shift our understanding of, sexual prowess that seems to be tolerated and celebrated in men, but is condemned and vilified in women. So she really wanted to assert a kind of agency that was monstrous and feminist both, in order to capture this kind of harsh commingling of racialization and sexualization that was attributed to Asian American women in representation, and say, I'm going to confront this. It's a very you know complicated story, but what was really, I think, striking about her work is, the way in which she wouldn't let go, of asserting this as an experience that she was authoring. And I think, it's very affecting to watch, because I think when you're watching pornography, it's very hard to distinguish between what pleasure and pain looks like when you're doing a close up on the face, and this is something, that was really very prominent in the language, of that film. I would be remiss to say that there was a lot of, you know, problematic um, events around it, in terms of, how the people who were making the film could be exploiting her, regardless of the agenda that she was forwarding for herself. But in some ways, there was a kind of position of equanimity that she was asserting. Like, she doesn't really say, you may be exploiting me, but you don't get to define the experience for me. I'm doing this for my own particular, reasons of, empowerment and undoing the trauma of sexual experience that I've endured in my life as an Asian American woman, she would say. And to try to create a different, narrative of triumph and victory that, others may disagree with. But these are the terms that she um, used to organize her experience.
I wanted to talk to you more about Anna May Wong. Anna May Wong is a big movie star in the early 20th century, one of the first, if not the first, big Asian female movie star who had to play many of these portrayals that we talked about earlier that you had to meet in these films. Did she ever talk about those things? Do we have an account of what that was like for her?
Anna May Wong, was a hugely talented, actor. If you were just to Google her name, you could see the wide range of emotion, that she was really able to express, really just on her face, as well as, the way that she had to, scurry around in an animalistic way in some of her most famous films, like, the classic film Thief of Baghdad. I think it would be an injustice to simply classify her roles as either Dragon Lady or Lotus Blossom, because that is what they look like. Toll of the Sea is the classic Lotus Blossom role: servile, suicidal, forever suffering, self-sacrificing. And then, the Dragon Lady is really in her one of her first major roles, Thief of Baghdad, where she is not only deceptive, but someone who really takes over the narrative and pulls it in a different way, in order to serve herself, save herself, be loyal to, who the men in the community who were representing Asians, within the film, because precisely of what you say, Mitch, which is, she really deployed fan culture and popular media in order to comment and critique her roles. She was very adamant about saying, why is it that there is this insistence and a commitment to render Asian culture as primitive when, she says this is a 1,000-year-old culture of dignity and wealth. So why are we simplified? Why are we rendered in this animalistic, primitive way? And she offered through these interviews, um, it's not just a critique, but a vehement assertion that this was truly unfair, for her, not only in terms of the limited, roles that she had to play, but the way the media constructed her as almost outside time, outside society. She never rode a bicycle, she had, such long nails that she couldn't function in everyday life. And she would explicitly quote them and say, why would you say that about me? I am an everyday American, woman. And so to me, it would be unfair to simplify her roles as one to which she did not contribute. So we have to be careful in saying these are merely stereotypes when actually the terrain of Hollywood has always been one composed of Asian American women actors like Anna May Wong, who fought for a different world, who fought for a different reality, and they wanted to use their own words and to demand for us as viewers in the future, as well as viewers of her time, to say, this is an imposition and an infliction, which I am fighting at the front lines. So it is our responsibility as spectators to dig up her own words, that describe her fight on our behalf.
Well, was she saying these things after she stopped making movies? Did she ever stop making movies? Was this something she could have said while she was making movies?
She absolutely said them while she was making movies, which is stunning, right? So she was talking like this in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and she died, right before she was supposed to be in that all Asian cast film, Flower Drum Song. So she never got to be in it. But that's what's so stunning about it. And that's why we must hear hers, because even at a time when she was being condemned by the Chinese community for portraying these roles that supposedly damaged the community, she acknowledged it by saying, should I be, deprived in a sense, of this amazing thing of which I have talent and opportunity, and I'm going to fight it, and I'm going to contribute to a different kind of representation. And so she did, try to get roles that she was not ultimately, given the opportunity to perform. And she also had to travel, to Europe in order to get opportunities, much like her contemporary Asian American, movie star, the male version, Sessue Hayakawa. And so she even chronicled, the need to do that as an experience of discrimination in the industry, in the Hollywood industry at the time. So she was adamant and fearless, bold, courageous, and brave, and it's very different from the way other Asian American Hollywood femme fatales, have had to speak. So hands down, bow down, to the power of Anna May Wong, who really used, fan culture at the time to reach out to people to say, don't experience movies as this simplification. Take my own words and let that show you what I tried to do on screen. So before you condemn it, really look at it as a document of my struggle.
Is this something that we would find with other Asian actors, actresses afterwards and forever after?
Yeah, it's so interesting that, we've really seen, Asian American femme fatales in Hollywood, 1920s or so. Anna May Wong, the 1960s, saw the rise of Nancy Kwan, who was a British Chinese actress of such humongous talent, so you can Google, classic scenes from the world of Susie Wong, where she's just so sassy and wearing her, her matching, dresses and bags and shoes, and really portrayed, the sex worker with a particular kind of innocence that I think really contributed a lot to the popularity. She had a lot of power within the film in terms of, asserting herself as a different option to white women. But then at the same time, she definitely had to say lines like, I will follow you until you tell me go away. So it's tricky, but she herself really resented, the assertion that what she was doing was really bringing down Asian women, that what she was doing in portraying a prostitute was representing Asian women only as prostitutes. And she wanted to say that there's a particular kind of achievement that my visibility um, is able to secure for us, through my performances, my celebrated, dance and song. And there truly is something amazing. If you'd like to look up I Enjoy Being a Girl, it's a performance really worth reading, in terms of, female power. What to do with, the assertion that you are hypersexualized and to somehow negotiate that in your performance. So it's powerful. I mean, it's mesmerizing. It's fascinating. She is really taking claim of the stage as someone worth representation, you know? But she definitely countered, the assertions by Asian American film critics, who said this is an objectified role, and she wanted to prioritize instead, what she was able to do for Asian American visibility. And then, 40 years, 30, 40 years or so later, the actress, Lucy Liu, burst into the television screen playing Ling Wu and Ally McBeal. And, she was proud, to create that role. It was once again like this role of power. She would say the word sex just by saying the word, it would affect everybody in the room, like some kind of natural, storm happened. So she herself would say, in her interviews that she was proud of this role, but at the same time, she would do like a double move and say, but remember, these roles I try to take in order to open other doors, to create opportunities, to prove, box office promise so that I can have more control in the future. And she definitely, tried to make films herself, as a producer, et cetera. And, wanted to get away from only, racially overdetermined roles. But she would definitely say things like, I have to take on roles because I have bills to pay. But she would also, there was a great interview that she did with Playboy that also, not only celebrated her own achievements as a star, but also offered a critique of what Asian American were undergoing in representation. So it makes you realize how Anna May Wong, precisely because she was alone, not very many Asian American women were actors at the time, really full force went for it in terms of offering a critique. And, Nancy Kwan and Lucy Liu are situated within different historical moments, the emergence of Asian American cinematic critique, Asian American nonprofit organizations that really bolster, strengthen, make possible Asian American filmmaking were happening at the same time that Nancy Kwan was emerging as an actor. And, Lucy Liu was also happening at a time when other actors were coming up and, doing different kinds of critiques like Margaret Cho and Sandra Oh. So, I mean, I'm particularly excited now about the different Asian American women-centered productions that we have seen released just in the past year. I'm talking about To All the Boys I've Loved Before, a very popular young teen, almost like a rom-com series on Netflix. Never Have I Ever, really based on growing up of a really well-known South Asian American actress, Mindy Kaling, the film, the half of it by Alice Wu, who made the film Saving Face almost 20 years ago to show, queer representations of falling in love as a teen. And of course, one of my favorite films that just came out in the past year, the first Filipinx American film to be released by a major Hollywood studio, Diana Paragas's Yellow Rose, which is about an undocumented Filipinx American teenager. And you can see in these recent productions that these films are squarely within the vast and dazzling expanse between The Dragon Lady and The Lotus Blossom. And you can really see these young Asian American women confronting sexuality in their own terms, defining sexuality in their own terms. So there's a lot of promising work that's happening in Hollywood right now regarding the sexual representation of Asian American women that's more empowering, that centers themselves and not this imposition of being for others that we've faced for the past 100 or so years.
Celine Parreñas Shimizu has been our guest. She is professor and director of the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. Her work does focus on race and sexuality and popular culture. In 2007, she published her book, The Hypersexuality of Race, and last year she released her book, The Proximity of Other Skins. Celine Parreñas Shimizu, I found that very important and really felt like we could have gone another hour, just sort of scratched at these issues. I hope we could have you on again to talk about this, but I'm very thankful to you for spending this time with us today.
I really appreciate the opportunity. This is a really very sad and enraging time for the Asian American community, and I really appreciate the light that you have helped to focus on this history that Asian American women have had to face of an imposition of hypersexual identity into our lives that we fight.
Well, we are grateful to you.
Time.
Yeah, well, we are grateful to you for doing this. So thank you.